Hello, you're listening to the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast for August 2022. Today's episode is going to be about physical illness and how people may react to that and how we can think of that in a personal construct psychology way. So I found a really interesting paper for this. In some ways I came across it by accident because I was tidying up some papers and it was in that pile. However, those things, you decide whether or not to read them, and I'd been mulling over whether or not to include something about physical health in this podcast. So I just found it at a lucky moment, really. So the paper is called The Constructivist Model of Psychological Reactions to Physical Illness and Injury, and it's by Viney. So it's taken from a book, and I'll put the reference in the show notes. I have to say the book is pretty difficult to get. It seems to be out of print. So it is available if you look on Amazon, and you might find it on eBay. But it's a bit old now, so it's 1990. Often publishers don't bother to reprint. What Viney does in this paper is outline a constructivist model that she developed through her research. So she did work with people with various kinds of illness and found that in the end there were certain things that cross across all illnesses. So any condition, any physical illness, the same kind of model will work for that. So if you work with people who have a temporary pain or a long-term pain, or maybe are not recovering very well, or you work in rehab, all of this stuff may be very useful to you. So what I'm going to do is talk through what she proposed, and I will also put the list of her propositions in the show notes. The reason for doing that is because of the unavailability of that book. So I've had a look and it's about £35. Most people won't buy it. However, this paper is really useful and her model is great. So I thought if I put it in the show notes, I'll put a link to it and you can download it. You'll be able to find it. So Viney first has some general propositions. People who are ill try to make sense of what is happening to them. For this purpose, they develop interpretations of the current experience in terms of their past experience. These intellectual, emotional interpretations, or constructs, also enable people to attempt to anticipate effectively future experiences. So, just in terms of how we construe everything else, we'll also construe our bodies and changes in our bodies. And those changes could be internal things going wrong with it, or external things that other people might be able to notice. She goes on to say, anticipation through the use of the construct system of already proven effectiveness may not be possible for seriously ill people who are under considerable threat of pain, bodily mutilation, and even death, so that their old constructs do not work well. Such anticipation may also not be possible if illness-associated events are new to these people, so that new constructs are needed. So if you think about that, the experience of being in a hospital, of talking about illnesses with medical professionals, will gradually give us a new set of constructs, or it will serve to elaborate the constructs we already have. In order to understand what the medical professionals are talking about, we have to ask, what does that mean? Is that the same as this? So gradually we will learn a new set of constructs which we'll be able to apply. If someone has an acute experience of illness, they won't have had time to develop these constructs. So they're likely to be potentially struggling more with this kind of suddenness of it because they aren't able to anticipate the events and they don't have the constructs they need to construe their experiences. She says, the constructs held by people about their illnesses may appear inaccurate to others, yet these constructs determine how people act. They influence their reactions to all aspects of their care, including their following of treatment schedules. So the way we construe our illness experience will influence how we construe treatment. For example, if we construe a life-threatening illness as a narrow escape from death, we might become extremely careful about looking after our health. We might follow all treatment instructions rigidly, and becoming very rigid about when we take medication, how we have to look after our body and what we need to do, and also in that reliant on the medical professionals to tell us how to interpret a new experience, so if we have a complication of some kind. Viney goes on to suggest some propositions about the construing of people who are ill. Firstly, people develop their constructs by interpreting their past experiences. For adults seeking back for illness-related constructs, this often means that their most relevant set of constructs may have been developed when they were children. When they try them out, they often carry evidence of earlier stages of their intellectual and emotional development. Now, I think it's important to remember here Kelly's suggestion that constructs can be pre-verbal, which means they've been developed before we had the words to explain and communicate our experiences. So these constructs are more likely to be connected with our sensations and may lack suitable verbal labels to discuss them with other people. Next, she proposes that people who are ill differ in how they construe current experience. No two people can be assumed to be using the same constructs, even if they are dealing with the same illness. The content and structure of the construct systems of each of them must be assessed. So if you think of an example like COVID-19, somebody who's had a lot of experience of pain and illness may construe having COVID-19 in a very different way from somebody who is very rarely ill. And we try and make sense of it using the constructs we've already got. There are bound to be individual differences in experiences, and those experiences lead to a difference in construing, and therefore the interpretation of what's happening to us. So having COVID-19 can be devastating, not much of a bother, depending on how severe it is, but also depending on what the degree of threat that offers to us. So if you were somebody who already had a compromised immune system, you might view having COVID-19 as a terrifying experience because you don't know how badly it's going to affect you. She says that ill people differ in the permeability of their construct systems, to the extent to which they can use them to make sense of new events, such as information about how their prognosis varies. So a permeable construct is one that can be used to construe other elements. And remember, elements are anything that we construe. So construct like fire is pretty impermeable, unless you're a firefighter or a fire eater maybe. Mostly it's going to be used to construe burning things. It wouldn't be applied to things that are not burning, so it's not permeable. It's a construct that is quite fixed in what it's used for. So a permeable construing system will flex and adjust to new experiences, leading to changes in construing. And some people's construct systems are going to be more permeable than others because there are individual differences. This might mean that they cannot adapt to having an illness or following a regime that they need to for their treatment because they don't have the constructs and the system that has a space for being an ill person, or they don't see themselves as somebody who needs medical care. Without addressing that, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to have a comfortable adjustment to being ill. And by comfortable, I don't mean that it becomes nice in any way, just that it doesn't lead to additional stress and anxiety because they don't know how to understand the experience. Viney says, people who are ill or injured may have constructs that are too loose and so make too many general predictions to be useful. They may also be too tight and too restrictive in their predictions. A construct such as hospitals are strange places could prove too loose and too restrictive for effective prediction, while one like I am a person who is never ill could be too tight. So this point really is about the usefulness of constructs to help us anticipate our illness and our treatment, so we can anticipate what's coming with less distress and confusion. And if we construe something like injections as inherently dangerous, having treatment could be absolutely terrifying. In contrast, if we construe our treatment too loosely, we might say walk on a broken foot and forget to do our physio exercises, and that would delay our recovery. So the way we construe actually could be very relevant, and we might need to move, as we do in everything else, between loosening and tightening until we get to a position that is useful for anticipations around our physical health. Viney's next suggestion is that ill people can change their constructs by reinterpreting their experiences. They can do this for themselves, but they may find it difficult in the restricting context of their isolation and disability. Relatives and health professionals such as nurses and medical practitioners can help them to do so, but sometimes a professional psychotherapist is necessary. So if you think about when this paper was written, 1990, or when it was published, probably written before and amended, like all papers are. So in 1990, really there was not a great deal going on thinking about the psychological impact of illnesses. So it was probably unusual to suggest that people might need psychological help to adjust to a diagnosis or to adjust to living with an illness or a condition. Now, at least in the UK, there is some help available, although it's still insufficient and has been focused on the most severe and life-threatening illnesses. Some illnesses seem to get a lot of funding, big organisations that do lots of fundraising, because they probably affect a lot more people. Other illnesses don't really get that same attention, and therefore they may not have a system for providing psychological help for people facing their future with an illness. Remember that from a PCP point of view, the psychological threat will be related to the person's construing, so their construing of their condition. So someone with a temporary and relatively minor illness can experience severe psychological distress, and somebody with a severe and life-threatening illness may be okay. It's entirely down to the way people construe things. Viney then has some propositions about the interpersonal construing of people who are ill. Firstly, health professionals working with people who are ill can relate to them meaningfully only if they understand their ways of making sense of the world. The ability of health professionals to construe effectively the constructs of their patient is very important. Of course, the reciprocal of the proposition is also true. Patients can only relate to health professionals who work with them if they understand something of their constructs. And this section really stresses the importance. This point really stresses the importance of being able to construe another's constructions, which is the sociality corollary. Without this, the two people cannot understand each other well enough, and they can't get on well in their relative roles. So, it's harder to be a great nurse if someone doesn't have an understanding of what nurses may do and the kind of attitudes nurses may have. So it's difficult for people who are ill to be good patients unless they're able to construe what medical professionals expect of them. So their anticipations of what a patient may do and which things lie within the realm of patient responsibility and which lie within the realm of medical responsibility. So medical staff, without that kind of psychological understanding of a patient may not understand why somebody is not complying with treatment plan unless they can construe their constructions. It might become very clear why they're not complying, but at first you're not going to know that unless you take the time to talk to those people. And one of the things, of course, is that people may not quite understand themselves why they're not complying. They just know they're not. And it takes some time and discussion to help them to work that out. Viney says, miscommunication, when it occurs, is more vital to patients than to health professionals, because people who are ill are dependent on those around them to validate their construct systems. Patients are therefore very vulnerable to the attitudes, role expectations, and misunderstandings of their health professionals. If they do not experience validation from them, they can experience a range of negative emotions. So, as for everybody, validation of our construing is vital to progress. If we do not want a particular treatment that we're being offered, say we think we've heard about a different one and we'd like to try and get that one, we may find ourselves construed as a difficult patient or as someone who challenges the role of an expert professional. Their reactions to our requests to consider all the treatment options again might lead to us developing constructs about the need to fight for treatment and construing the medical staff as not open about options unless we persist with our fight. Now that leads to quite a different relationship between doctor and patient or nurse and patient. So if they handle the request with the intention to understand how and why we're making that request, then they may validate our sense of self. So it could be that somebody is asking for a different treatment because what they've read is that another treatment will give them a few extra months of life. As a parent, they want that few extra months of life because they are desperate to stay alive for their children. Now, the doctors may have a completely different view of that and be thinking, all that's going to do is give you a few extra weeks on terrible painkillers, and you won't be able to do anything for more weeks of your life. The patient doesn't necessarily know that until they can talk about it. If that doctor dismisses the request without discussing it as to what it is someone's hoping to get out of it, then their response may be seen as a kind of barrier or a block to what the patient wants for their care, perhaps leading to a complaint. Instead, if they took the time to talk and say, how did you imagine it going if you got an extra 3 months of life? Then they could have a more meaningful discussion and help the person to understand what they currently don't understand without invalidating their sense of self. Viney goes on to say, even when good communication between physically ill people and health professionals occurs, it is often the case that some constructs will receive more validation from them than others. Constructs of helplessness receive more validation from hospital staff for their patients, for example, than those of competence. Acceptance of such constructs may prevent effective rehabilitation and preclude ill or injured people from eventually taking responsibility for their long-term health care. Psychotherapy with such people may be needed so that these iatrogenic outcomes of professional care may be avoided. I didn't know what iatrogenic means, so I'll tell you as well. I had to look it up. So it means relating to illness caused by medical examination or treatment. So from our point of view, the way medical care is organised and delivered in the UK is complicated and it's shrouded in mysteries. So even if you just took the level of walking around a hospital, it has rules about how and where we can go. And those rules are not explicit or explained to a patient or a visitor. The way a clinic works varies by clinic. So if you've already been to a clinic, you won't necessarily find that terribly helpful in the next clinic. Whether or not there'll be students will vary not only by clinic, but also by time of year. So, you might have a time where there are many students in the room whilst you have an examination, or a time where there are none. And we don't, as patients, necessarily have any idea about that and how it works. So we may not have our assessment, illness, or treatment explained in a way that we can understand quickly. So these experiences are likely to validate that sense of helplessness or having to go with the flow in order to get what we need. One of the things that's likely to happen is we'll be asked to give consent repeatedly, probably in writing as well. but without any proper understanding of what we're consenting to. I find the consent forms for operations really quite terrifying. And when I've read them, I've felt, whoa, this is a real big risk having an operation for this. So these kind of experiences are likely to lead to the development of constructs about our helplessness and reliance on medical advice. And then that makes it more difficult after discharge because we're suddenly cut off from that medical advice and we're on our own. And we haven't been able to develop the constructs about our illness or treatment of what may happen after the illness in a clear enough way so that we're okay to stand on our own 2 feet. So then Viney has some propositions about their emotions. And she says, when people's construct systems enable them to interpret and anticipate what is happening to them effectively, they experience positive emotions. And when their systems are not effective, they experience negative emotions. Examples follow. People who are ill become anxious when the events they experience are beyond the range of convenience of their construct systems. They grow anxious when they cannot meaningfully interpret a new piece of diagnostic information, or when they're asked to make a decision about a risky treatment in the absence of sufficient information. So when we have a diagnosis or a treatment explained to us, we will only be able to construe it based on our construing system. And if we have very few constructs around the condition and the possible options, we're going to find that very difficult. Doing something like Googling our likely diagnosis and treatments can be really unhelpful because the information is filtered by Google, which is probably machines that have decided the most efficient set of results for us. And this can very quickly lead into us construing ourselves as if we have the condition, interpreting symptoms as an indicator of Google being correct. That kind of approach can be very difficult then when we go and see a medical expert who says, no, we don't fit the diagnosis that we've come for assessment for. That can be really disappointing and realistically quite frightening for people, because if it's not that, yet all the stuff they've read on the internet seems to indicate it is, what is it instead? And often if you can say, well, okay, it isn't that, but it's this, that's helpful because there's still something there. If you say, as a medical professional, I don't know what it is, the person who's come to see you may find that really quite terrifying because they know there is a problem. What you're saying as a medical professional is that's not what the problem is. And for some problems we don't really know, which is not really what people want to hear from their medics. So in terms of Coventry and Warwickshire Partnership Trust, we made the Dimensions of Health and Wellbeing site to help with that really. So it has information which has been read by clinicians and is found to be unlikely to be harmful. It's free, you can use it yourself, you can make a personal profile of relevant issues, and then you're able to find different levels of information according to the level of difficulty that you have, rather than the fact that something is present. I'll put a link in the show notes because you can have a go with it. So hopefully it's useful. But it was because we were finding that people were Googling instead. We didn't give them enough information, and some of the information they came across very quickly suggested, they go from never seeing anybody about a problem to immediately needing to see a psychiatrist. And there's some levels in between where you need to be sure that that person needs to see a psychiatrist and get the right people to the doctors and have the other people have some help in a different kind of way. Anyway, the link will be in the show notes if you want to have a go with it. And you can recommend it to other people. And it is available across the world, actually. I also think that risk issue is very big because the mathematics of probability is involved in that. And we might be being asked to give consent to something where we have no proper understanding of the risks. So we can't really give proper consent. I've watched 2 really interesting TV programmes on UK TV which showed this problem really clearly. And both of them were by Hannah Fry, who's a maths professor, and she's a TV and radio presenter. One was about her experience of being diagnosed and treated for cancer, and generally about cancer treatment. And the other was about people who did not want to have COVID vaccines. And both the programmes illustrated really well that people can find it very difficult to understand probability, and that makes their assessment of risk really difficult. They're worth watching, I think, these programmes, so I'll put the links in the show notes. One is called Unvaccinated on BBC Two, and another one is called Making Sense of Cancer, which is a BBC Horizon programme. So in terms of emotions, Viney also says, people who are ill become angry when they're trying to secure validation for a construct that has failed them in their attempts at anticipation. When a construct such as I can cope by myself or I can understand everything that happens to me are testing and found wanting by ill people, recognition of their inadequacy leads to anxiety. Attempts to gain more support for them by bluff or argument, however, are expressed in anger. The frustration-related anger, which is also appropriate, should be expressed directly for psychological well-being. In hospitals, for example, because of patients' constructs about themselves and that context, the anger is expressed only indirectly. In this way, the anger is perpetuated rather than put to good psychological use. So Peter Cummins' definition of anger is really useful to think about here. Anger is an emotional expression of invalidation. And he stresses that anger isn't the only emotional expression of invalidation, it's just one of those. So for a person who is ill, they may be invalidated in a way that is unbearable for them and they can't cope anymore. So their anger is related to the anticipation of invalidation of their construing. So then it makes us wonder, so what invalidation is happening? Which constructs are being invalidated? And they're going to be pretty important ones. So if you think of something like facing a diagnosis which is life-limiting, what's being invalidated is your sense of yourself as immortal. And you really have to look at the path to death in a way that you don't really want to, because you're not ready for it. So what's being invalidated is construing about life and self, moving on through time. Pretty big issues. So Kelly has an emphasis on being curious and exploring construing. And that exploring is likely to be more useful in helping people to understand their own anger, what constructs are being invalidated or what it is about their construing of self that's being invalidated. So Kelly had an emphasis on being curious and exploring construing. And that kind of approach is likely to be much more helpful to a person than the posters that we now have in the NHS in the UK saying that we won't tolerate behaviour which is threatening. They always puzzle me really, because if we're in a situation where people are experiencing potential for invalidation in death, or a life-changing injury or a life-changing illness, what do they do with those experiences? And it may come out as anger. So their anticipation is that things are going to be terrible in some kind of a way, and it's very difficult for them not to pop out as something. In PCP terms, we would want to understand how and why that person has become so distressed that their only option seems to be to shout and scream at staff or to push people away. The trouble is that takes time, and time is less available to the NHS than anything else probably. Viney also says the other way in which physically ill people may deal with their anger is to turn it on themselves. This is a process which eventually imprisons them within their own self-blaming construct system, together with feelings of depression. So when a person's anger can't be expressed and addressed and understood, then the option might be to kind of fold in on ourselves and be angry with ourselves about allowing ourselves to become ill. or not trying hard enough to get better. And in conclusion, Viney says, expression of anxiety and anger should occur for all physically ill people. Therapists can help with this process. They can also help when the construct of ill people are too loose or too tight. Yet another indication of a need for therapy may be seen in those who use a construct consistently in the face of evidence which invalidates it, as when a woman with advanced cancer maintains that growth is not cancerous. So there's a clear point that she's making, that there is definitely a role for psychological support for people with illnesses. And what I would say in terms of how things are changing in the NHS now is that people are understanding that there is a consequence psychologically from being ill, and there is a growth in physical health services, having psychological supports available to people. Whether we'll get to the point where psychotherapy is available, I'm not sure, but thank goodness there is some change, that things are happening. And it is being understood better and better that we can't just leave people to somehow deal with the physical consequences without it affecting them. One of the things that I felt after I read this paper is that it was a really nice model. It explains things well. It's very clear and easy to read. May be useful if you work in a service like that to share it with other people, which is why I'm going to put it in the show notes. Because it's something that you could pass on to people to explain a kind of PCP approach to supporting them with their ill health. And obviously, all of us at some point become ill. It's helpful to think that this is part of the human experience to have a reaction to illness. And as a PCP approach might suggest, that understanding what the meaning of that illness is for that individual person is absolutely crucial. And it's very difficult to help people without some understanding of that. The system acts as if people are going to be okay. And it's only the people who are not okay in a big way who might be able to get any support with that, because they might hit the criteria for mental health services as well. It's unfortunate that that's the case, because for many of those people, they were okay before a devastating diagnosis. For some of them, they may never have been okay, and this is just another stress on top of things. And we have to take that individually. So any kind of help that we offer needs to be tailored to that individual person, understanding them, and then moving on to help them as an individual to move in the directions that make sense to them. That's not going to be the same for two people. So if you found that useful or interesting, you could always let me know if you don't mind. Send me an email or a message. You can do it through the MailChimp thing that is connected to my website, or you can email me directly at drawingtheidealself@icloud.com. I'd like to hear if you found it useful, because I can never be certain that what's going on in here is useful to people. And it makes a real difference if people tell me, yeah, that was a helpful episode for me. And if I can just help one person at a time, that's okay. Okay, so the next episode that we'll have will be in September. And that's going to be an interview with Sam Beasley, who is an educational psychologist. Okay, I'll see you in September. Thank you. Bye.